Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. You know, it only dawned on me recently that Mario Maker is basically the gamification of a dev tool. I don't know how or why it took me so long to realize, but now that I do, I feel like I could probably do something similar. I mean, I've always wanted to make a level editor, and honestly, learning to build myself some dev tools might actually improve my workflow in the future. So today I'm challenging myself to create a dev tool / level editor similar to Mario Maker. It'll feature tile placement for both cosmetic and functional objects, and also, just to make things more fun instead of a platformer, we'll apply this on top of randomly generated dungeons. Sure, this is gonna make it more Zelda than Mario, but it's still pretty damn challenging. So let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. In preparation for this challenge, I've done some minor work prior to recording. The first being this lovely layout for our editor, which features several walls and floor tiles, plus a few enemies and the player object to boot. And here's a peek at the draw code in case you were curious. Nothing too fancy really. Next, we're not starting entirely from scratch here. I'm actually merging two unfinished projects I've been working on in my free time to pull this challenge off. The first is some dungeon generation code, which was inspired by the egg code from our attempt to clone Ultrabugs. It's pretty basic and nowhere near complete, but it'll provide a solid base for our layouts to spawn in. The next bit of code is really old. I'm talking back in the early GameMaker Studio 1.4 days. It's a system I built to create games like Picross, but because this code is so old, we're really only carrying over the idea, which is how to handle and compare strings. This will make more sense later. For now, it's time to get started on the challenge. First up, we needed to make our Fuzzy editor interactable. I started by creating our spawner object. This object will record and pass on tile data as they are placed, and I used a 2D array for easier handling in the future. Next, we needed a few variables, one to define which category we're under, the other to define the tile's ID. These variables would be determined based on whatever the cursor is currently hovered over, and will pass on the data to our spawner object. Speaking of which, returning to the spawner object, I gave it a placed variable. If not placed, we stick it to the cursor while remaining on the grid. And if all is well, left-clicking places the tile in the room. So far, we're making great progress. Don't mind that flash of numbers, those will make sense in a bit. With our tile placement working, we now had to store this information. I created a little script that would pass on any placed tiles data to a temporary data grid. Each tile placed would replace an existing entry in the grid with its own data. This is what all those numbers represent. With our script working, we needed a way to delete entries, so I simply added a new script that reversed what we did in our previous script. And it's here that I forgot to add collision masks to my tiles, so instead I ended up writing a bunch of unnecessary code to check for positioning to delete tiles. Regardless, this worked, and so we moved on. Next, we needed a script to save our layouts to a list, but before we could test this, I realized that some of our tile IDs were single digits and others were double. For the sake of simplicity, I made sure that all IDs were double digits. And the read grid script used here simply converts all those numbers you see in the grid into one long string. Speaking of which, it was time to implement that old Picross inspired code. And now let me remind you all of the importance of taking breaks, especially when it comes to writing code. Otherwise, you may end up importing old code, some of which doesn't seem to make sense, but you import it anyway. Next thing you know, you're wasting time trying to fit it into your current code, but it's like trying to stick a square peg into a circular hole. It's just not working. Suddenly, over 2 hours have gone by and you're left with a jumbled mess and ready to flip a table. But cooler heads prevail and you take that break that you should have taken over 2 hours ago. So after taking a much needed break, it was time to reflect. The problem we faced here was converting a singular 360 character long string full of IDs back into grid format. The navigation of the string was the most frustrating part. And with a clear mind, it was pretty obvious that all we needed was a variable that increased with the loop. Unfortunately, during my 2-hour stress fest, I converted our ID system from numerical to alphabetical. And so instead of trying to undo it all, I just went with the alphabets and a state system. I cannot stress enough that this is a bad way to do this, but desperate times call for desperate, unoptimized measures. And with all our objects painstakingly coded into the script, we could now test this with our editor via the test mode. Placing tiles in build mode and hitting test would deactivate the spawners and create their corresponding objects in their place. And for all intents and purposes, this should directly translate to how the level will appear and behave in the actual game. So now that we know that the generation system works, we had to test them in the actual game world. So I gave the generation script some new parameters to make sure that the layout origins match the rooms, and used our editor to build some funky little test layouts. Hitting play put us in the game where you can see the dungeon being built out, but sadly nothing spawned. Turns out the reason for this wasn't anything technically wrong, it's just that I used the wrong function to obtain data from our layout list. Instead of using the value check function for data lists, I was using the read function. Switching to the proper function though meant that our code now works exactly as we wanted. The silly little weird layouts we built in the build mode now translated one for one to the game world. And like I said at the start, the dungeon code was far from finished, which explains the lack of locks or other features often found in this type of game. Also, I totally forgot to set the depth for floor tiles. But really, the point was to create a setup similar to Mario Maker's editor and translate that data into actual gameplay, which we accomplished to a certain extent. Now, this is far from user-friendly, much less release-worthy, but still I think we did a pretty good job, and we all deserve a nice pat on the back and a nice nap, because as we've learned, breaks are very, very important. So with that said comes the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on this challenge in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.